Alrighty. Hello, everybody. Great to see you here today. As you heard from Simon, I am Marcelle. I hail from Maryland in the US, and I'm pretty sure we're having gorgeous fall weather right now without rain, but I'd still rather be in the Caymans. And as Simon mentioned, this is my third time at BSides Cayman Islands. It's one of my favorite conferences, and I love meeting folks, so definitely hope to meet quite a few of you while I'm here. You can talk to me about maybe moving here. I'd be down. Anyway, so you see what I'm talking about. I went with kind of like a beachy theme because I was so excited to be coming down here. I'm like, oh, beach pictures. Anyway, so you got a little bit of an intro about me, but I am a principal information security engineer and the lead for threat research at Equinix, and I'm going to tell you about Equinix in a minute. I'm also on the board of directors for a fabulous organization called Women's Society of Cyber Jitsu. If you haven't heard of it, well, actually, I'm going to have a slide for that too, but there are a few ladies here from Cyber Jitsu. Some of them are sitting right up here in the second row. Mary is our CEO, so it's I'll tell you about it in a minute. And then, yes, adjunct professor. I teach at University of Maryland, a variety of like certification prep kind of courses primarily. I have 4 degrees and a lot of certifications, which I did not list here. I am a career changer. I have not always done cybersecurity. So basically, it's been about 12 years now that I've been in the industry. Before that, I was not even technical. I was like operations and project management. So I have a very soft spot for users. You will never hear me bash users because I used to be one of them and I understand the pain. We do not do a good enough job in this world, basically, about making things easier for our users and just enabling them to be more secure. And then I'm at Marcelle Lee on most of the social media platforms, LinkedIn, Twitter, whatnot. I really don't use Twitter that much anymore. I kind of don't like it so much, but I am still on there. So anyway, so a bit about Equinix. Who here has actually heard of Equinix before? Well, yes, a few of you, okay. So it is the world's largest data center company. We have over 260 data centers all around the globe. Well, and 99.99 whatever uptime, but I'm not a salesperson. So anyway, it's a very unique environment to work in because like everything is a threat to us. You consider we have our standard corporate environment, but we also have ICS and OT operational technology because that's what runs our data centers. So think of like building management systems and all the things that are connected to that. And then also geopolitical concerns. It's huge for us, right? We're always on the lookout for like what might be happening in the world that could impact access to our data centers or our employees or whatever. So work a lot with like physical security teams and corporate security. All right, that's enough about Equinix. And then Cyber Jitsu. So my slide about Cyber Jitsu, this is a nonprofit that's all about getting more diversity in the field. And our focus is primarily gender, but really diversity across the board. Anybody can be a member. You do not have to be a woman. So we encourage people to sign up. And that's the website. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today. Basically, I'm going to cover trends that I'm seeing in the field and talk a little bit also about possible mitigations for some of the things that we're seeing. You all probably just saw John talk. He probably scared you a little bit. I will continue in that same vein because that's what we do. But hope is not lost for sure. So just quickly, some of the things I'm going to talk about. Ransomware, obviously, is very much still a thing. Stolen credentials, this is mind-blowing, some of that information. The use of malvertising, SEO poisoning, fake browser updates, so on and so forth. More sophisticated social engineering, which John touched on also. increased use of legitimate services in attacks, increasing supply chain attacks. That's really something that's just growing leaps and bounds. More intense DDoS attacks, like the DDoS attacks of like 10 years ago are like so nothing compared to what they are now. Shorter timing, I'll get into what that means for teams. And then last but not least, malware being written in a variety of different languages. So let's get into each of these. All right, so first off, the ransomware threat landscape, it's still super, super prevalent, as I'm sure you all know. But the tactics and techniques that are being used by the threat actors are really getting ramped up. So a few different things that we're seeing, and when I say we, I mean like just us in the threat intel industry, right? Increased use by state-sponsored threat groups. This is kind of a departure because we typically associate ransomware with cyber criminals, but we are seeing more and more state-sponsored groups get into this. And for an example, there, North Korea's Stonefly group. This is, I'm very much a rip from the headlines kind of presenter, so you'll see lots of like snippets from different news sources and whatnot. I also will have a list of like all the links that I'll share out with folks afterwards if they're interested. So we're seeing this with North Korea, but we're also seeing it with Iran, China, and well, Russia was always kind of hands in hands with cyber criminals, so that's not that new. But yeah, this is different. Another thing that we're seeing is just different ways that threat actors are trying to get companies to pay the ransoms. So denial of service attacks, this is something they're like, okay, if you don't pay the ransom, we're going to DOS you until you do, basically. That's becoming fairly prevalent. Swatting, phone calls, so on and so forth. So this is a particularly egregious example, but there was a children's hospital in the US that got breached earlier this year. And they actually, first of all, it's bad enough that threat actors are breaching hospitals. It used to be kind of like an unwritten rule that you didn't impact organizations that, you know, could ultimately cause harm to people, but that's like so out the window now, everything's fair game. But at any rate, they got the names of like patients and were threatening to swat the patients. And if you're not familiar with swatting, it's where you basically make a call or whatever to the police department and say there's some heinous crime happening at an address, and then like the whole SWAT team, which is where swatting comes from, shows up and like knocking down the door to say, we're here to, you know, take care of whatever. And it's all fake, but they were threatening to do that to patients of this hospital, which is just crazy. Phone calls. So one of the headlines there is one threat group was using phone calls like to different people in like the executive's family. They were calling his wife and just generally harassing people. So this is all like kind of really beyond the pale. And I think it's just going to continue to advance, like whatever they can think of to pressure will continue to be a thing. Also, threats of public exposure. There was one ransomware group that basically said they were going to notify the SEC that the company had not filed their obligatory disclosure about being breached. And that's Security and Exchange Commission in the US. You're probably familiar with that. And they came up with a new reporting rule last year, I think in December. You have 3 days to report a material cyber incident. So the threat actors were like, oh, well, they didn't report it, so we're going to contact SEC. So all just kinds of ways to like make an impact. And then the whole exit scam thing, this is interesting too, because a lot of the ransomware groups are operating as ransomware as a service, right? So there's one ransomware group that, you know, is the operator of the program. They probably develop the malware as well. And then they sell this to their affiliates. So there's a whole affiliate program. And John was like joking about like, you know, Black Matter having that little AI kind of chatbot thing on their site. This is like, this stuff is run as a business. It's 100% like a real business. And there's a ton of money to be made, so it's not surprising. But anyway, so exit scams are basically when a threat group just decides that they're going to pull up stakes and take off with all the money. So in this case, like when Black Cat did that, they left all their affiliates like in the lurch because they just kept all the money and didn't pay out anything to the affiliates. So think about where that leaves you as an organization. If you're the one that got ransomed and you've paid the ransom, but meanwhile the ransom group has just like skipped town, and so nobody's, like the person who actually ransomed you didn't get the money, you've lost the money, and this is just, well, okay, this is going to come as a huge surprise to you, but threat actors are not trustworthy. You cannot rely on them to do what they're supposed to do. So yeah, so lots of different things happening in the ransomware space, and you know, I'll see people talk about like targeting of different verticals, so on and so forth, and it always makes me a little insane because it doesn't matter what industry you're in at all. Like, ransomware is a crime of opportunity. So if a threat actor can get into your organization relatively easily and, you know, you have any kind of money at all, then they're gonna pop you. And it's nothing to do with whether you're in finance or healthcare or whatever. It's where they can get in. So this is a screenshot of a dark web post. I think this was Breach Forums, if I remember correctly. And just to show you an example of what this looks like. So Fortinet was recently breached, and so they basically just put on the dark web forum a description of what they've done. And then in this case, they've also, where I've highlighted in the lower box, they've said some really unpleasant things about the CEO. But yeah, so this is another one where they're threatening to do the SEC notification. But yeah, this is the kind of stuff that's out there all the time. So from a mitigation standpoint, one thing that I would recommend is you want to know if your company is being referenced on these dark web forums. Like, you definitely don't want to hear about a possible breach in your environment because like somebody saw it on Twitter or something, right? You want to be able to get ahead of it. And I'm not here to sell any services, and I'm not going to talk about like our tech stack, but there are tools that you can use to monitor for that kind of activity. You definitely want to know if your company is being mentioned in these kind of situations. Of course, if you've been ransomed, you already know, but there's a lot of stuff that happens, you know, pre. All right, so another pretty hot topic is stolen credentials. There is a massive, massive amount of stolen credentials out there in the world right now. And just some of the recent headlines, you know, AT&T got popped and they stole the records of nearly all the customers. Like, that's millions and millions of people, right, that they've gotten information for. And also ADT, which is a security company, not cybersecurity, but like home security, they got breached twice, and basically because of using stolen credentials. And as the one headline says there, stolen credentials have turned SaaS apps into attackers' playgrounds. So I'm going to show you on the next slide a little snippet. But so this is coming from information stealers, database breaches, so on and so forth, and then just straight up credential harvesting. So when we talk about phishing, at least in our environment, the number one type of phish that we see is a credential harvesting phish across the board. And so that's basically where, you know, the threat actor sends an email with maybe a link in it, and it's going to go to like a fake Microsoft login page or whatever, right? This is very, very common. But I will say, I do this like quarterly phishing report for the company, and the last quarter, our phishing numbers went down like dramatically, like from 90,000 phishing emails to 60,000 phishing emails in a quarter. That's a huge drop, right? I attribute that to the fact that there's just so many credentials out there that the threat actors don't need to fish for them so much anymore. You can just go on the dark web and buy them. So this is another area where you want to be monitoring for your employees' credentials being out there. It's something that we do internally. Again, I'm not going to espouse any particular tool, but you can definitely get services that will look for that kind of information. Because you want to know, like if you have employee credentials that have been exposed and potentially with passwords, a lot of times with passwords, somebody can use that information to get into your environment. And I've seen crazy things like Okta credentials just being totally exposed. Not for our company, fortunately, but for other companies. And then I'm always like, oh my gosh, I feel like I should tell them or something, but I don't really know how to go about doing that. But yeah, it's a huge thing. So information stealer malware, I think that John touched on this a little bit in his talk, but basically it's malware that is on your computer doing just what it sounds like, stealing information. So it's going to be any number of different data points, but also a really important thing to know is that these information stealers are quite capable of stealing credentials that you store in your browser. So one piece of advice for you, I'm sure I'll have more than one, but this one is do not store your credentials in browsers. Do not use Google to store your credentials. Chrome is what I mean really by that. Safari, any of them. Threat actors know how to extract that information, and they do. So it's much better to use an actual password manager, like a standalone thing. So there's that. And there's a zillion different stealers out there. This is a brand new one I've never even heard of, but I thought the image was kind of cool, so I just threw it in the deck. But we see a lot of like Redline stealer, Llama stealer. They're just massively prevalent. And they get delivered to your people usually by phishing, also drive-by downloads. So yeah, they're hard to avoid. Okay, so screenshot here for you. The one in the middle with like the pink, that's me covering up emails and passwords. And this is all related to the Hot Topic breach, which just happened. And is anybody familiar with Hot Topic? It's like a clothing store for like tweens. I'm not really sure. I don't personally shop there, but they got popped, and it's apparently the largest retail breach ever. Like this is just from like last week. 350 million customers, and basically this is showing like logins to the Hot Topic site by various people. There was thousands just in my tool that I was using to find that. So yeah, it's definitely something else that you want to keep an eye on, your employee exposure. Okay, so malvertising, SEO poisoning, and fake browser updates. Woohoo, all the fun things. Malvertising, the screenshot on the one side there with KeePass is an example of malvertising with a bit of SEO poisoning involved. So essentially what happens is threat actors will set up a website that looks like a legitimate download page. So you'll see this for anything that people are going to commonly Google. So if somebody Googles like download Adobe whatever, or download KeePass, or download whatever, these results come up and they're not legitimate, but they come to the top of the list because the threat actors are paying for like Google whatever service to promote them. So this is super tricky for your users as well, because if you see a result pop up in Google search, like at the top, what's the chances that you're going to click on that one, right? I personally always ignore the ones that say sponsored and go further down because I don't trust that at all. And in this case, like you wouldn't even be able to tell because KeePass, like that appears to be the actual KeePass domain, but they did a little trick where they used something called puny code, which is sort of like it's not ASCII, it's like ASCII with a lot more characters. So it'll look like ASCII, but it's not. It will actually render as a different domain, but it appears to be the actual one. So it's impossible. Like nobody could tell that just by looking at it. And then the other thing is these fake browser updates. And this is really associated a lot with the information stealer malware. We see tons and tons of this kind of thing in our environment. But basically, you'll go to, say, like that KeyPass site, for example, and not the real one. And then you're going to get a pop-up that looks like that. And it's like you need to update your browser. And these are really sophisticated campaigns because they use traffic direction services, which is basically used for the ad industry, right? So you know how, like, if you go to a site, it kind of like knows that you're on iPhone or whatever. Like, all this is kind of traffic direction. So basically, if I land on this page and I'm using my MacBook, it's going to tell me something, like it wouldn't tell me I needed an Edge browser update, right? Because chances are I'm not using Microsoft Edge on my MacBook. I 100% am not, but although I think you actually can. So it's very specifically geared to whoever is hitting that page. And again, it looks super realistic, but I will say one thing you can tell your users is that this is not how browsers update, right? Browsers will have a little thing in the corner that you may or may not ever click on that says update. If you have that in the corner of your browser, click on it and update, but it's not going to present like this. So that's definitely like an education point that you can work on with your people. Yeah, and this is the part too, the last slide, but threat actors are making bank. They have money to spend on things like traffic direction service and SEO, search engine optimization, and so on and so forth. All right, so more sophisticated social engineering. John touched on this earlier. He was just saying how, you used to kind of be able to rely on phishing email looking like kind of poorly written or whatever, but I will tell you that threat actors also use AI, just like we do. And how hard is it to, say, craft an email that is targeting? Well, you couldn't say targeting because then like GPT would be like, no, you can't do that. But you can just define like what you want that email to look like, who your intended audience is, and it will create it for you. Another thing that I see in terms of the use of AI is making very convincing websites. So it's super easy to do. Like you could basically say, create a website that looks like PayPal.com, and it would just generate that HTML code for you. So we definitely see it. But on the good news front is that we're also being able to use AI within the security community too. So it does empower us to do better like threat detection and things like that. So these are some examples that came out of our environment. We got a new CEO this year, and I don't even know if she'd started yet, and our employees were starting to get all kinds of smishing, so SMS phishing, right? Smishing? That's so hard to say. I don't know who comes up with these. Adam's favorite words coming up next. But anyway, so threat actors, if they have their eye on Equinix, they're going to be like, oh, there's this new CEO. Let's see if we can phish some people. And this particular one, I think it was WhatsApp. We have a huge presence in EMEA, and lots of people use WhatsApp over there. So we do see tons of targeting that way. But yeah, it looks like a dare. That's not a dare's phone number. And it was definitely very targeted, though. It was for a very specific person. We've seen campaigns like this in the past where they reach out by email, but then they're like, can we take the conversation over to like WhatsApp or some other channel that's not like a sanctioned communications channel? And the whole point is that they're trying to get around like your internal security controls, because chances are you're not monitoring WhatsApp conversations, right? Although it would be a good idea to do that probably because of data loss prevention. But anyway, so so as soon as they get to that, like taking it off, the main comms channel, then like negotiations start in earnest. And one that we saw not too long ago, there was somebody in finance who was being targeted, and she went and took the conversation offline or whatever, and they were very subtle, like in asking her for information, but then basically it came down to they were asking her to like do some financial transaction, and she finally was like, oh, wait a minute, this is a little suspicious. And good on her, she reported the whole thing and shared all the comms, so we got to see all that. But yeah, I know I said the thing about opportunistic, but there's definitely threat actors that could be targeting your organization very specifically. And with Equinix, we see that all the time, right? They might want to get into us just because we're a Fortune 500 company, so we probably have some money, but also because we have really high profile customers. Chances are, like, I don't know, something like 90% of all internet traffic goes through our data centers each day. So your data probably has flown through at some point or another, or you might even be a customer. But yeah, so the potential for access to high-profile government, whatever, customers is one reason that we're specifically targeted. The other example there is, it was a phishing email, and there was a Word doc that was attached to it, or maybe it was a link to a Word doc, I forget which. It could be either, of course. And within that Word doc, and this is Chinese language, it was actually targeting an employee that we had in Hong Kong. So I forget exactly what it says, but something like, click here to, access the document or whatever, or not click here. So this is called quishing, which is QR code phishing. And I have to say, Adam hates that word. I kind of hate it too. It's like, oh, it's so quishy. But anyway, I find it baffling. Like, I can't even imagine a part of my day where I would get an email that had a QR code in it. So I'm gonna like get my phone and scan that QR code on my laptop or whatever, but people do it. These are wildly successful. So there's definitely something to educate your users on. Nobody's sending you anything legitimate with a QR code. And I think unfortunately, like with the pandemic, QR codes became kind of normalized because they were used a lot for like, I don't know, menus and that sort of thing. So people got used to clicking QR codes, but it's not just phishing. Like I've read reports about QR codes on like EV charging stations, for example. Like you go and just like scan the code so you can like sign up to pay for your electric vehicle charging or whatever. And it's malware. So people are apparently just going around and slapping up malicious QR codes all over the place. So tried to get people to stay away from using QR codes. Okay, so another thing that I find particularly challenging is the use of legitimate services in threat activity. So many different examples, but workers.dev, and again, here I'm going to espouse having a phishing solution or an email security solution of some sort, if you're able to, because it's crazy out there, all the phishing. But workers.dev is a very legitimate service, and the little code snippet there is basically 4 lines of code. You stand up a subdomain at this workers.dev thing, and it's super, super easy. Threat actors use it all the time. We get hundreds and hundreds of these workers.dev phishing emails in our environment. And it's tricky because you can't really block workers.dev, right? It's a legitimate site. And it's the same thing also with IPFS. IPFS is the Interplanetary File System, and it's kind of this weird like peer-to-peer file sharing thing, but it's legitimate. It's used for whatever legit purposes. But again, tons and tons of phishing that comes in. So, I mean, you could at least maybe tune your security tools to say, double check anything that's coming from these known domains. But then you get into search engines. So we're seeing a ton of phishing links or malicious links being distributed as like basically a search engine result. So the first thing somebody's going to see on that second little box there is bing.com. Who's going to look any further on that? They're just like, oh, bing.com, this is safe. It's not, because it's literally pointing to a malicious domain, which they just do rather easily by manipulating the search results. And then another interesting one that we saw just in the past couple of weeks, and here I'll give a shout out for like information sharing. We have something called ISACs in the United States, which literally is information sharing. I always forget the A, the C, consortium, I don't know. Anyway, you get the idea. And so like for my organization, we belong to the IT ISAC, which is for IT-related companies. And we also belong to the real estate ISAC because we are organized as a real estate investment trust. So that's relevant for us too. So, you know, you might not have that here in the Caymans, but any kind of intel sharing relationship you can get into, like I highly recommend that, because you just will get stuff before, you know, other people do, and you might get like tipped to different kinds of campaigns. So the TikTok thing actually came up in an IT ISAC, like a weekly technical committee call, and somebody was just like, hey, has anybody seen this TikTok phishing? And like I immediately like log into our email security thing, and I'm like, boom, yes, we are seeing this. But this was a really interesting campaign because it made use of so many different legitimate services. So, okay, is TikTok a legitimate service? I'm not 100% sure, but we'll just put it in that category for now, right? So yeah, so they were using TikTok, and basically it was like a video link, but in that whole long link there, you'll also see where it says google.com and then the slashes and AMP. It's the Google AMP service, and it's something about like optimizing search results or whatever. I always learn something new every time I research one of these because I'm like, what's Google AMP? I've never heard of it. They also use Cloudflare to add legitimacy to the whole phishing thing. Like if you come across a Cloudflare, you know, are you a robot, or check in to make sure you're a real person or whatever, you're probably not going to think that that's a malicious site. But again, threat actors are using these services that, you know, you have to pay for. They're not doing everything like on the cheap, like I feel like they used to. And then ultimately you get to that skycom.com.sg domain, which resolves to credential harvesting, Microsoft, right? Or Outlook in this case. So it makes it very hard to keep track of all this stuff. And it's really impossible, like to do email blocking based on like domains just is not effective because there's a zillion new domains all the time that are being spun up. But you can certainly look for certain behaviors and that kind of thing, and that's gonna stand you in good stead. Okay. So supply chain attacks. This is something that, as I mentioned earlier, is becoming more and more prevalent. As it says there in the little subheading or whatever, a company's billion-dollar cybersecurity program is only as good as its smallest vendor's cybersecurity program. And threat actors are definitely well aware of this. So they're looking at organizations, companies that might be used broadly by others. So like Okta, for example. ServiceNow, this just came up like yesterday. ServiceNow is being, well, I don't know if they were actually breached or what happened, but let's just say there's something going on with ServiceNow. So you might want to check that out in your environment. But yeah, so software companies are a prime target. Hardware, so like say, for example, Cisco got breached. How many companies are using Cisco equipment? Loads of them, right? Third-party services, delivery systems, so on and so forth. Really, the sky's the limit. And so the different attack methods that we're seeing here are malware, of course, social engineering, vulnerability exploitation, and credential theft. So credential theft, we've kind of talked about a little bit already, but a lot of that is information stealers, which again, I can't even say how prevalent they are, it's crazy. And also the credential harvesting that we talked about. So vulnerability exploitation, I just want to pause there for a second because these are the three main ways that threat actors are getting into your environment, right? It's exploitation of vulnerabilities in like internet-facing devices, the credentials, any kind of credential abuse, basically, and phishing. These are like the top three ways that people are getting in. It is nothing typically super sophisticated. You know, you'll see like companies report about being breached, but they were like, it was clearly a very sophisticated APT, whatever, and it was probably like some 13-year-old sitting in their mom's basement, right? But it looks better to say it was very sophisticated. Anyway, so vulnerability exploitation is huge. And what you really need to be aware of is your attack surface, right? And there's so many organizations that I see, talk to, whatever, where they don't really even know what assets they have, let alone what's hanging out there on the internet. And if you don't know, then how do you protect those assets? And examples of things that might be exposed are obviously email servers. They have to be exposed to the internet in order to work, right? But again, are your email servers all up to date with patches and so on and so forth? If they're not, they should be, but you don't really know this if you're not paying attention to that attack surface, basically. There's an open source tool called Shodan. You can look for free for your company's name or whatever and just see what's out there, Shodan. But again, there's also services that you can buy. So basically vulnerability management and that attack surface management. All right, so just some numbers here. This was actually a slide I put together for some board presentation. So you notice it's different than my other slides because I'm mostly lots of pictures and this one's lots of words, but that's how they liked it for the board thing. So supply chain enabled ransomware attacks generated $500 billion US dollars in ransom payments in the first half of 2023, which was all the stats that I could find. That's so much money. Like when I said before, threat actors are making bank, they really are. It's crazy. And then another thing was by 2025, 45% of organizations will have experienced some sort of supply chain attack, 3 times the level of 2021. And then basically, this next stat I find particularly compelling because it's 150 companies provide 90% of global tech products, but the top 15 provide 62%. So that means 62% of companies are using something from this top 15 list. And unfortunately, they didn't provide like the companies because I would have liked to seen that list. But anyway, they had below average security scores, and that does not make me feel warm and fuzzy, right? So a huge part of the world is relying on these companies to provide whatever service, and their security is not up to snuff. So obviously, know your supplier is a thing. Another program, if you don't have this happening in your environment, I highly recommend it. Again, there's tools that do this for you, but at the minimum, like when you're onboarding a supplier, you should be asking them questions about their tech stack and their security and all that kind of thing. You don't want to sign up for somebody with like janky security, basically. So it's something that you can incorporate for sure into your onboarding of suppliers. Okay. So this is just an example of a recent-ish, well, it was this summer, but polyfill supply chain attack. So polyfills are basically like little code snippets. And this is, again, like as a threat researcher, you learn about so many random things because I'm like, what's the polyfill? So I had to ask Google, of course. But yeah, little code snippets that basically contain like links to redirect to like another site. And so this one domain, cdn.polyfill.io, belonged to somebody, and I guess they just let the domain expire. It was like an old project. They weren't actively managing it anymore. And a Chinese company, and you read into that what you want, snapped that domain up and then basically started using the domain, which is embedded into a zillion websites, to redirect people to malicious domains. So pretty crafty, right? And the thing that kind of is very compelling to me about this is, like, they must have been like waiting for this domain to like expire, and then they just hopped on it right away. So threat actors are definitely looking for ways to do these supply chain attacks. So fortunately, somebody basically sinkholed the domain or something, and it turned out to not be like a massive thing. You might not have even heard about it, but it had the potential to be a massive, global kind of issue. So it was primarily being used to send people to gambling sites, but it could have been used for anything, right? So interesting case study. Okay, and on to distributed denial of service attacks. Again, I mentioned earlier, we're seeing these just like crazy, intense DDoS attacks. So Cloudflare, of course, has an eye on what's happening in the DDoS space, and they reported that 4.2 terabits per second is like the worst DDoS attack that they've seen. Think about that, 4.2 terabits per second being directed at your web server or whatever resource, right? Pretty much anything's gonna fall over if you get that much traffic sent to it. And even Cloudflare can't necessarily help you with that one. We're also seeing more like application layer DDoS attacks, and not all firewalls are capable of detecting that. It is something that you want to check your web application firewall for. And things that threat actors tend to like go after is, they don't necessarily care about your website being taken down. That was like a thing where it was more like a hacktivist kind of thing. But now they're going after like your API endpoints, your customer login portals, things like that. If you take those down, it's going to be problematic for people to access, their environments or do business things with your organization. Let's see, what else? Yeah, just some stats there about DDoS attacks, but 150% increase globally since 2021. I mean, that's pretty huge. A new cyber attack occurs every 39 seconds. I'm like, how many have happened just while I've been up here talking? Quite a few. Hopefully not in the Caymans. Anyway, I'm not going to read all the things to you, but DDoS is something to be concerned about. And so this is where, I mentioned looking at your web application firewalls or the provider that does that for you, and just make sure that you're tuned sufficiently to withstand an intense DDoS attack. You may or may not be. And you don't want to wait until you have an attack to find out. So that's a tuning thing that you can do for sure. And then also just being aware of those exposed portals, API points, all that kind of stuff. Like, know those and make sure they're protected. You want them to be behind some kind of DDoS protection. Equinix is not immune to DDoS attacks. This was actually from last year. And Anonymous Sudan, who's a well-known hacktivist group and recently just had a couple of their members arrested, they said, hey, we're going to start taking out companies, and the first one we're going to go after is Equinix. Why? We don't know. But again, this was our dark web monitoring, right? So we saw this before they even did it. And I mean, it wasn't a very exciting DDoS attack, but they did do it. So it can happen to anyone. All right. I'm going to try to wrap it up. I'm almost finished. Shorter timing increases pressure. So this is a big deal, right? John showed in his thing like 2 seconds or whatever for ransomware to be deployed and infect or encrypt an entire box. But that's not even the thing that concerns me too much. And really, like, you need to take care of all the stuff that happens before ransomware deployment. So think of all the phases of an attack, right? Use the MITRE ATT&CK framework if you don't already, and Adam can tell you more about that. But how are they getting in? What's that initial access vector? What are they doing when they're in your environment? Like, these are all things that you can detect once ransomware has been deployed. It's basically too late, right? You want to stop the activity before it happens or gets to that level. But the dwell time thing is interesting to me because it used to be like the average dwell time was something like, 120 days. So how long the threat actors were in your environment before they did whatever they're going to do. So ransomware encryption or data exfiltration or both, as often is the case, that dwell time is shortening dramatically. And so that's a SecureWorks report where they're talking about 24 hours. Like, for you to be able to detect something happening before it leads to ransomware or whatever, but in only 24 hours, that's really hard. That's super hard. Nobody usually would have even the cycles to detect that. So that concerns me a lot. And then also the time to market for vulnerability exploits. So you'll have a new vulnerability come out, and it is not long before there is a working proof of concept exploit or just straight up exploitation in the wild. And it's a bit tricky because, with responsible disclosure, people do need to share like how they exploited that vulnerability. But then, of course, it's also used by threat actors. They're like, oh, perfect, somebody created a POC. We'll just work that for our own measures. And then the SEC filing deadlines, I mentioned that before, it's 3 days in the US to report a material cyber incident. Everybody's scrambling right now to figure out what is material, and I'm sure you all probably have something similar. All right, and last but not least, malware written in a variety of languages. Why do we care about this? We care about it because that makes malware more multi-platform, right? So it used to be that the vast majority of malware was written for Windows, and that's simply because there's a lot of Windows computers out there. But we're seeing malware that's now being written that is specifically for Macs or Linux. So there's some sort of false comfort when you're on a Mac or whatever that you think you're maybe not going to get a virus, but that is 100% not true. You absolutely can on a Mac. And then when you think about Linux, you're probably like, well, I don't have any Linux computers, but almost all the web servers in the world are Linux, Apache for the most part, right? So very, very common, very targeted. And then think about all your Docker systems, your virtual environments, all these things, malware is being written specifically for those environments. Okay, I think I am right at the end, but anyway, that was it. This is my email if you want to reach out about anything. I will share the links in the deck and stuff probably on my GitHub later. But yeah, it's been a pleasure talking with you all. Thank you. And I don't know if we have time for questions or not, so a minute. All right, does anybody have a question? Oh, I see one all the way in the back. Lindsay's the runner.
Hi.
Hi.
First of all, nice to see you again. We were in the panel last time at BSides.
That's right.
Welcome back to Kiman. I just wanted to add on your point of quishing and using QR codes, something that is relevant to Kiman. What we're seeing a lot, especially, is with the rise of crypto industry and a lot of that, a lot of people use Telegram, and a lot of people add each other on Telegram. So there's a lot of stuff happening with that, because there's obvious scan that you can use it in the wrong way and add another device by mistake, especially if two-factor is not enabled. And like this is something that I feel like for K-mine industries is very relevant.
Yeah, for sure. Telegram, really any comms platform is either being targeted by threat actors or used by threat actors or both, right? So a lot of the threat actor activity that we see is on Telegram. And that's something that we also monitor for, like with using those platforms that I was talking about before for dark web and other kinds of activity. Good question or good comment. All right, any other questions? All right, I think that might be it then, so.